Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the April edition of Plants, Pests, and Pathogens. I'm Ariyah April, the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program Assistant. We are so glad you're here with us today. We are learning about what successful plant and pest disease management looks like in North Carolina home landscapes. And Matt Bertone and Mike Munster from the NC State Plant Disease and Insect Clinic will focus on common fruit trees in our state. After the presentation, Matt and Mike are going to address our BOLOs, or the plant pests and diseases to be on the lookout for this month. We're also going to hear from Charlotte Glen, who is our program manager at the statewide Extension Master Gardener Program. Charlotte is going to present Plant These for Pollinators on Blue Star, like the pretty one you see here. That's going to get us to 11:30 a.m. Before we kick off the presentation, we want to share some great news. We're thrilled to say that we surpassed our fundraising goals on Day of Giving. Thanks to your incredible support and the challenge gifts made by two anonymous donors, we did raise $17,935 for the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program Fund and $10,000 for the NCEMG Endowment. That's incredible. So these gifts provide critical funding to strengthen our ability as volunteers to serve North Carolina communities. And we're so thankful to everyone for being part of this effort. Also, we are happy to announce that registration is open for EMG College 2026, Become a Pollinator Ambassador. You do not want to miss this opportunity for advanced training. So please go to go.ncsu.edu/EMG-college, maybe not right now, but after PPP presentation, and register if you're not already. Now on to today's episode of PPP, Pests and Pathogens of Common Fruit Trees.
Good morning to all of you, and glad to hear that there's more rain out there. Hopefully we'll get some too eventually here in Raleigh. So we first want to set the scope here of what to expect from our conversation today, which is going to be a long one because it's a big topic. But just to say, we're going to limit ourselves to apples and pears, to peaches, although these would probably apply to nectarines as well, and to edible figs. Those would be the three fruit trees that we're going to be focusing, or four that we're going to be focusing on today. So those of you who are all excited about pecans, persimmons, papaws, pomegranates, other pea things, and our citrus, which of course are our patio fruits, we will not be covering those today. Let me just start out by saying too that fruit trees on poor sites are going to have more problems. So you can expect more disease if the tree is not growing well, if you've got a lot of excess moisture, humidity, fog, and so forth. So keep in mind the importance of siting your trees properly, getting enough sun, having the correct soil pH, and so on. Cultivars do vary in susceptibility. We won't get into this, but at least on the disease side, there may be some cultivars that are less susceptible than others if you're having problems with a particular disease in your area. And there are some cultural controls that can be implemented, and I'll mention a few of those. But the important thing that I want to emphasize is that unless you've got a high tolerance for disease and pest damage, in most years, you're going to need a good pesticide spray program in order to get a good crop, especially of our apples, pears, or peaches. So keep that in mind. We will not be going into any kind of details about excuse me, sprays or products or schedules or anything like that. But suffice it to say that they would be needed in most years unless you're going to, just accept the fact that you're going to have these kind of losses. All right. I wanted to start out with kind of a historical question, though, and let me launch a poll here. So there was a gentleman back in the 19th century by the name of John Chapman, who we know as Johnny Appleseed. And it turns out that he established a lot of apple nurseries around what then was frontier America. And he also, there was another plant, though, that he distributed quite a bit of, a little bit more controversially. Was it A, alligator weed, B, bear's breeches, C, catnip, D, dog fennel, or E, elephant's foot? So let's see what folks think about this particular historical question. Give just another few moments here. was kind of proud of myself. I came up with 5 different things that all have animal related names and have the letters A through E on them for our choices. All right. Let's go ahead and end the poll and share it. So looks like a plurality anyway, almost a majority said D, dog fennel. And in fact, that is the correct answer. So apparently Mr. Chapman believed that there were some medicinal properties to it, and he spread those around with me. It is native, but it has a tendency to be weedy. So let's return now to our theme of what diseases and pests would we find on these fruit trees, these apples and other things. So I am going to set this up. There's a lot to say about apples and pears, and I'm going to be selective. And I decided to do it in pairs, P-A-I-R-S. So I've got 4 different kinds of pears here. I'll be talking about 2 different blights. I'll be talking about a couple of different things that are where the pathogen is related, but not the same thing. Talk about a couple of pathogens that are multi-purpose and a couple of, well, I'll just say problems that are only skin deep, at least, yes, in our apples and pears. So let's start out with a tale of 2 blights. So we're going to talk about fire blight here, which is our top dog in terms of the diseases that we see on apple and pear. Over 10% of our diagnoses on apples and pears that come into the clinic is this particular disease, fire blight. And then I also want to talk about thread blight just because it's a really interesting looking pathogen. Fire blight, of course, is caused by the bacterium Erwinia amylovera. When we tend to get it into the clinic, it's in what's called the shoot blight phase here, where you see the necrosis of leaves and of stem tissue, oftentimes with the classic shepherd's crook at the end of that new growth. And here are a couple of examples from samples that we received in at the clinic. The one from Gaston County there on the, no, I'm sorry, the one from Transylvania County. Here's what it looked like in the clinic when it came in. Again, a close-up of that shepherd's crook. Now, this particular disease is, again, it's caused by bacterium, and it overwinters in cankers on the tree itself. And then as the bacteria ooze out from there in the spring, they're spread to the blossoms by some of Matt's friends, like flies. I suppose it could be spread by rain splash too. I'd have to check on that. And it causes a blossom blight. And then even, think of it, pollinators can move the bacterial cells around from blossom to blossom. Those blossom infections then, as if they weren't bad enough in themselves, can be the source of the inoculum, those bacterial cells, for the infection of the shoots when the new vegetative growth starts to elongate. And again, injuries, including insect injury, can be the pathway or the entryway for that bacterial infection. And it can cause quite a bit of damage. Pears in particular are quite susceptible. Again, there's some variability and susceptibility among cultivars, but we do see it on both pear and apple. And if you're going to be pruning these out, if you're doing it in the active season, you have to go way into healthy tissue. It doesn't suffice just to say, okay, it's dead up to this point and I'm going to cut there. I've seen 1 foot as a recommendation. I've seen 60 centimeters as a recommendation. So you have to go quite a ways back into the clean wood if you're going to be pruning these out during the active season of active development of fire blight. So this is something that we'll start out fairly early, but you can see that last picture was from September. So we get it in the clinic, not just in the spring. This was a sample that came in just recently, and we don't know what it was. At least I don't know if Mike Schwartz solved it. First, it sure looked like fire blight, but there was the shepherd's crook, although notice that the crooking is not necessarily on black tissue here, the necrotic tissue, it's happening in the green area. So something else is going on here. We're not sure. Looking at under the microscope, there was no bacterial streaming, did a test and it was negative. So not everything that is a shepherd's crook of necrotic tissue on an apple or pear is going to be fire blight, but that should be your first hypothesis anyway. The other blight that I wanted to mention is called thread blight. This is caused now by a fungus, and I don't usually put in two different names for things trying to avoid confusion, but this one I decided to because you may have heard it by the corticium name, Corticium stevensii. But Ceratobasidium ochroluscum is the accepted name now, as far as I know. And this is more of a summer disease. The leaves will blight. They'll hang on to the tree. So that's something similar with fire blight and different from some of the leaf spots that we'll be seeing in a moment, where defoliation is an important part of the symptomatology and the damage. But in this case, the leaves hang on, and you can see some mycelium development there, the fungus on the leaves, but also when it gets on the stems, it'll tend to form these mycelial strands. I hesitate to call them rhizomorphs, and sclerotia, these kind of tufts of fungal tissue there on the surface. This is favored by excess moisture. So if you're in a really foggy site, if your branching is very dense, you're going to have more problem with it. However, it's not usually a serious issue because it's held in check by the sprays that are used to control other fungal diseases. And it can affect both apples, pears, and also there's a number of other plant species that we've seen it on. So that is thread blight as our paired example of blights along with the fire blight. So another kind of pairing I want to mention is that of different pathogens that are related but not exactly the same. And I've got a couple examples here. One of them is, of course, our gymnosporangium rusts. So these are fungi with complex life cycles. They alternate between junipers as one host, and different members of the Rosaceae, although not roses themselves, but other rosaceous hosts. And here's this particular graphic. It's a little bit confusing because I am not sure, I've got that question mark there, what the most common species that we see when we get it on pear. But it does seem to come in on the fruit as the main source or the main location of infection. Whereas apple, we mostly see it on leaves, and it's the cedar apple rust, the Gymnosporangium juniperi virginiani, that is going to be the most common on apple. And the symptoms look like this very early in the development. So coming up soon, within the next month or so, we're going to be seeing the pycnia develop on the upper leaf surface. They could be confused for little insect eggs or something, that kind of bright orange color. And then as the fungus develops through the leaf and on the other side produces it's what's called eschia that burst out with these little star-like frilled pustules that release the spores that are dispersed to the, if they're lucky, to the junipers and continue the life cycle. But what we usually notice is somewhere maybe late May or late June in our area here, these bright orange marked with red spots on the leaves. And again, the leaf drop can be an important part of the problem here of this disease, the cedar apple rust. Fruit infection can occur, but it's not as common. And on pears, again, I'm not sure I see in our clinic records that we've been calling this the quince rust, but I am not convinced that it is. I know that is reported on pear, but I would have to withhold judgment on exactly what is the particular gymnosporangium that we see when we do get it on pear. And of course, as on our calorie pears, the ornamental pears is quite common with both fruit and stem infections with swellings associated. So there is a couple of siblings, or there are a couple of siblings there of rust fungi that affect our apples and pears. Another example of siblings but not the same thing would be Marcinona leaf blotch and Fabrea leaf and fruit spot. So the Marcinina does occur on apple. I'm not sure actually if it occurs on pear, but we think about it on apple. It is a fungus, Diplocarpon coronarii, and you notice the irregular kind of edges on these particular leaf spots, along with yellowing, you can get defoliation. And if it reminds you of black spot on rose, that's a good thing because, yes, this is a similar fungus to the one that causes black spot on rose. Another relative, Diplocarpon mespili, is what we see on causing Fabrea leaf and fruit spot on pear. And So you see the lesions there in the photographs. And if that fungus name looks familiar, that is the same one. I don't know if there's any pathogenic specialization in it, but that is the same species that causes our famous entomosporium leaf spot on Indian hawthorn and on photinias. So here are a couple of different relatives that we might see on apples and pears. The fibria can also occur on apple, but I don't think it's really a serious issue there. More we think about that as a pear pathogen. So another pair of fungi I want to talk about are two that are kind of multi-purpose. And these are bitter rot and black rot. But I'll be illustrating these on apple. So bitter rot is caused by a couple of species. I'm not sure more one of them. I have to double check on this, but there are a couple of species of Colototricum that can get on apples. And bitter rot is one of the diseases. When it's on the fruit like this, it will have a sunken lesion. And I'll show you in a moment a picture of what it looks like when the apple is cut open. And there'll be spores produced, kind of salmon colored masses of spores on that decaying area. And this is also the fungus that causes glomerella leaf spot on the apple. Whereas black spot is Botrytis obtusa, and that lesion will be firm, not sunken, and it will have a different sort of profile when you cut it open. It'll be a cylindrical sort of invasion of the fruit rather than a V-shaped one. Its dual purpose is that, well, really three. It causes a disease called frog eye leaf spot on the foliage, and also on older apples can cause cankers. So these are our multitasking fungi here that we have to be concerned with. Now, I do want to make sure and point out that bitter rot and black rot are also names of diseases of grape, but those are different fungi involved. They're not the same ones that cause the diseases of those names in apples. And I believe pears also. So here's a close-up of the bitter rot. You can see the sporulation here in the middle of that lesion. And here's the V-shaped cross-section of the decay when the apple is cut open. You'll also see on the photograph on the left a few of these small dark dots, which we'll be talking about in a moment. And that is the subject of ugliness is only skin deep sometimes. So the two that we saw a moment ago, the bitter rot and the black rot, do go into the flesh of the apple. But we have a couple of problems that are only very superficial. They're just in the cuticle. So if it's not too severe, you could actually eat these. They used to be thought of as two different fungi, one that caused something called sooty blotch, which are the more diffuse dark areas, and one that caused fly speck, which are the ones that have the individual dark flecks there separated. You can see it also in the close-up here. Now, however, it's known there are something like at least 3 species that cause fly speck and dozens that are associated with sooty blotch. And together they're collectively called a FSSB for fly speck sooty blotch, or SFSBFS for sooty blotch fly speck. So it's a complex of different fungi, but they all are characterized by this very superficial infection of the fruit, but a very common problem in the Southeast in unsprayed trees. Oh, by the way, don't confuse this with sooty mold, which is the development of fungal growth on the droppings, the honeydew of insects, or on other exudates like plant exudates. Now, these are actually fungi that are infecting the cuticle. All right, very quickly, some of the things to do to deal with your apple fruit rots: make sure that dead branches, mummified fruit, and fire blight stricken twigs are pruned out of the trees so that you have less inoculumness, less fungi, less, excuse me, bacteria for the following year. And don't leave those things that you prune, don't leave those on the ground, because some things may be able to actually reach the canopy from there. Removing infected fruit as soon as you see them, and again, maintaining your fungicide spray program. A final word on apple, and a nice picture here from Matt. This is something that sure looks like a disease, or you might think it looked like one of the pests that Matt's going to talk about, but burnout is a physiological problem. I'm not sure if it has some genetic component because it is particularly a problem on certain apple cultivars, but this rather scary looking thing is not actually a disease. It is a characteristic or a phenomenon known as burnout. All right, moving along then to peaches. A little bit simpler picture here. I just want to highlight 4 different diseases: armillaria root rot, peach leaf curl, blossom blight and brown rot, and peach scab. So to start though, I do want to say that gummosis as a symptom, here's a picture that Matt provided me, a really pretty dramatic version of it, but that's a response of Prunus species to different kinds of problems. So just because you see gummosis doesn't mean you have a diagnosis in hand. You got to do a little bit more digging, usually literally, to figure out what the problem is behind it. But I want to start out with this disease, armillaria root rot. So the tree there on the left from Randolph County, there was not only the armillaria root rot, I should say, but also some possible crown gall and a high population of lesion nematodes in the soil there. But we had a case just this year, a couple of weeks ago. Someone brought in a couple of his trees, 2 to 7 year old range, I believe, from his home peach orchard. They had leafed out this year and then collapsed. And sure enough, looking under the bark at the base of the main stems and in the larger roots, there was that mat of fungal mycelium characteristic of armillaria. Now, this could occur on things like apples as well, but it's not usually a big problem there. Where we do see problems is in our peaches and other amenity plantings, as the British call them. Another important disease on peach, or at least a common one that we have seen in the clinic, is peach leaf curl caused by the fungus Taphrina deformans, a spring infecting fungus that will cause the leaves to become red and distorted in this way. More important, though, are the diseases caused by a couple of species of monolinia, which are fungi. So this is what is the blossom or twig blight phase on peach in the springtime. And then later in the season, as the fruit are maturing, you get what's called brown rot. And the entire fruit can become completely engulfed by the pathogen. You see the sporulation there on the surface, and then it can be left as mummies hanging on the tree. So 2 different phases of the same fungus causing these 2 different diseases: the blossom blight or twig blight and the brown rot of the fruit. If you've got a small tree, small number of trees, you can prune those mummies out and those stem cankers. But again, your fungicides are going to be your main line of defense when you're trying to prevent brown rot. I should mention the difference between brown rot and peach scab. So 2 different fungi involved, one causing that softer brown rot, the other causing darker lesions. And it's the early infections of the scab that are serious because you get enough of them there, and then that outer portion doesn't grow at the same rate the inner part is, and the fruit splits as it expands. At least that's the mechanism that I think is involved, but you do get splitting of the fruit there. So that's something you want to make sure and prevent, where the brown rot is something you're going to see as the fruit are maturing. Another thing that you might confuse peach scab with is a bacterial spot, but the scab is going to be more raised and the spot's going to be more sunken, possibly water soaked. That bacterial spot, that we don't see that. That's not something we would see a lot of. In fact, at the clinic, really, I look back, we don't have records of the scab in the period that this database covers. However, I have seen it, I believe, on an ornamental peach there in front of Kilgore Hall, Ariyah and Charlotte. So we'll have to be looking out for that again. For peach scab, don't plant in low sites. Make sure you've got good airflow by pruning, and your fungicide spray program. With all these spray programs, make sure that you're observing your pre-harvest interval, that you're not spraying within a certain, whatever the label specifies, period of time before you're going to be harvesting. Then moving on to edible figs, the picture gets even simpler. Really, we worry about 4 different major problems, and I wouldn't even call all of them major, but let's just do this as a quiz. Launching our poll here. So of these four problems that we would see on fig, are we looking at in these photographs? They're from the same site. Is this frost or freeze injury? Is it the result of root knot nematode? Is it fig rust or fig mosaic? And I'm really not going to talk, as you're thinking, I'm really not going to talk about the frost or freeze injury, except to say that this is also cultivar dependent. So some fig cultivars are going to be more tolerant of the freezing temperatures than others. All right, it looked like A, C, and D jumped off to a big lead, but then B pulled from behind and has now got, well, it's about the same plurality as we had for the previous question. I'll share those results. So, yeah, again, almost a majority of folks saying that this looked like B root knot nematodes. And good, you didn't get fooled by like all this fungal sporulation here. That's a red herring. We do see the wilting here, maybe some yellowing, chlorosis going on. But yeah, this is the result of root knot nematodes. There's extensive root rot, but the thing that we saw here was the real massive galling on these particular roots. So that was the root of the problem. If you'll allow me yet one more pun before I turn it over to Matt in a moment, just to finish with a couple of things you may see on the foliage. Fig mosaic can have either mosaic, or here we can see some kind of ring spots. Some of them look a little rusty, but not everything you see that looks rusty on figs is actually rust. That's a lighter one, small pustules, not as obvious as those gymnosporangium rusts. But in years when it does have heavy severity, high severity, you get leaves that kind of curl up like this you see on the right. But the actual rust fungus is rather slow, and you have to, those spores are light colored, you have to look for it in order to see it. All right. I wasn't even watching the time. I was just trying to keep up the pace there. And so I will turn it over to Matt.
All right, thanks, Mike. All right, I am going to talk about, let's see, let me share the screen. I'm going to talk about arthropod pests of these same hosts. And so yeah. So I'm going to talk about apple, pear, peach, and fig arthropod pests. And just a first note about them, there are several pests that can be common to all these hosts, and I'm going to be talking about some groups of them. Different plant parts are attacked, so keep in mind some are only going to be on the foliage, some are going to be on the stems, some are going to affect the flowers of the fruit. And obviously the fruit is one of the most important parts, and so that's the part that most people want to protect the most. There are pheromone traps available for some of these pests, and I'll mention that later. But as Mike mentioned as well, spray programs for pests are also very intense in home orchards, and you have to be on top of things because any little bit of damage can cause downstream effects, especially injury from insects that can lead to disease, infections, or rot in these plants. So okay, and then although we're talking about edible fruit, many of these pests are common to their ornamental relatives. For instance, we've found peach tree borer in cherry laurel, which is an ornamental, but it's a prunus. And because it's in the same genus as cherries and peaches and all that, it will attract the same pests. So, some general arthropod pests of fruit trees. I'm not going to go into these in much detail, but just know that spider mites are very common on all these. This is actually an apple tree right here that was left in the lab, and you can see all the proliferation of the spider mites. They will cause bronzing and stippling damage on the plants. They're a sucking pest, and the little mites can be seen here over on the right. Lots of scale insects attack fruit trees. So you'll get soft scales like licanium type scales. These are on oak, but the ones that are going to be on the fruit trees are very similar looking. San Jose scale is an armored scale, as is Japanese maple scale and white peach scale. Figs, for instance, get a lot of Japanese maple scale. So don't always go by the common name either. White peach scale can get on other types of plants. In fact, it's also called mulberry scale, but many of these have a very broad host range. And so armored scales and some soft scales can be very big problem of these plants. Bark and ambrosia beetles. So these are secondary insects. They are attracted to dead and dying plants, and so they're more of a sign that something's going on. You can have these colitis bark beetles that you can see they create these galleries under the bark, and you'll see little exit holes and entry holes. And under this, if you peel away the bark, you might even find some larvae and pupae and whatnot, and sometimes the adults. But again, these are on damaged branches or dead or dying trees where they invade. And the ambrosia beetles bore right into the wood where they seed it with fungi. They grow the fungus in the tunnels and then feed on it as adults and larvae. But again, these are going to be signs that something else is going on with the plant and not a direct pest. A lot of leafhoppers and aphids are present on these plants, and leafhoppers can actually cause hopper burn when they feed on the young shoots. The toxic saliva can cause it to burn like that, but these are very common on different types of fruit tree leaves. And finally, Japanese beetles. When the time comes around May or June, we're going to start to see them, or actually around June or so, but it depends on the weather. We'll start to see the adults swarming around. They will land on leaves. They feed on lots of different plants, which include a lot of the plants that we're talking about today. Here's an ornamental prunus, but again, they will feed on all different types of plants. So there are a few pests that are found commonly on pears, apples, and peaches. And the first one I'm going to highlight today is the plum curculio. So curculio is basically just a name for a weevil. So this is specifically a type of weevil in the family Curculionidae. The adults are small and very rough with these mottled patterns. They actually, on the fruits, and you'll see in a second, they mimic dead plant material or even frass and stuff like that coming out of the fruit because they look like little dried kind of plant material. The larvae are legless and have a distinct head. So if you were to open a fruit and find one, it'll distinguish it from the maggots and some of the other things we're going to talk about later on. Most of the damage is from the actual egg laying of the adults and then the larvae tunneling in the fruit. The female will lay an egg and then cut a V-shaped scar in it to help the larva have a little space to develop. The larvae may not survive in harder fruits, but they will still try and lay eggs, which causes the superficial scarring and some subsurface kind of damage. And so they can be a pest of even harder fruits like apples, where they're just laying eggs even if the larvae don't develop fully. Typically, there's one generation per year, and the adults, the ones overwintering among leaf litter are in the area. So controlling the leaf litter can help reduce the places where these overwinter, and they become active around bloom or pedifall for these plants. And so you can see here's another image. They have these kind of ridges on them. Here's a photo of one kind of holding in a weird posture, makes it look kind of like dead plant material. Here's the grub-like larva. Again, they're completely legless. They don't have any legs at all, but they have this nice true head capsule here. And then the scars, the feeding and the egg laying scars in fruit are very distinct. They're this crescent shape with a little wedge at the base. They're almost kind of like a little seashell, but it's got this very distinct fan-shaped damage that is caused by the adult females when they're laying eggs. And so that's a key characteristic to look for to know that you have plum curculio. Oriental fruit moth, or OFM, is a tortricid moth, and you're going to see that's a very common family of moths that attack these types of things. Philida molesta is the species. These are small, dusky moths with pink or pale caterpillars that has an anal comb. And although that sounds strange, I'll show you it in a second, and it'll all make sense, hopefully. But caterpillars will bore into the fruits or shoots and leave crumbly frass coming out. They'll meander, but rarely move into the pit of the fruit. And so you'll see kind of meandering lines around there. They overwinter as fully grown larvae in bark and leaf litter, and then pupate in the spring, and then the adults emerge, they mate and lay eggs, and this can have several generations per year. And there are actually traps for monitoring this species. And just to show you what they look like, they are kind of very pretty, even though they're a little drab, they're very pretty little moths. These tortricids are kind of cute. I think they're very little cute little insects, but obviously they can do a lot of damage. Here's a larva from inside a fruit, and the tip of the abdomen between the final prolegs, you have this little anal comb. This is upside down, so it looked like kind of like teeth, almost like vampire teeth hanging down. That's actually a very common character in a lot of tortricid moths, a lot of these leaf rolling moths, but this will distinguish it from the codling moth, which we'll see in a few minutes. And here's some gummosis from boring and the frass. You can see it's almost like sawdust coming out, and then this is shoot damage from the trees. So these moths, the larvae will bore into both fruits and shoots of the trees and can cause damage. Brown marmorated stink bugs, or BMSB, is a stink bug in the family Pentatomidae. These are brown stink bugs with striped antennae and mottled pattern, and many of you are familiar with these. These are the ones that overwinter in homes and can be a very big nuisance, but not just a nuisance, they can also obviously damage plants because they are plant feeders. So once they move into the natural areas in the spring, they'll begin mating, laying eggs, and feeding. They are piercing, sucking insects, so they don't chew on the fruit or the leaves, but pierce it to suck out the juices and can also digest the material in the inside. When you feed on fruits, it may cause external deformities, which is called cat facing, and I'll show you that in a second, or not. On peaches, apparently, when they pierce them, they don't show much external damage, but inside the peach can have damage, which makes it unusable or just kind of gross. And the internal damage often causes corky tissue. This is also the same in tomatoes and peppers when they feed. But as you'll see here, here's this lumpiness of this pear that's called cat facing. And if you cut inside, you'll see this corky tissue where the stink bugs have fed and caused the tissue to deteriorate and collapse. On peaches, you can see numerous stink bugs on this peach. They're piercing it, and you may not see those superficial kinds of symptoms, but inside you'll see little corky and little necrotic kind of spots within the flesh of the fruit. So these can be a very severe pest of fruits. All right, so for pears, there's only a couple specific to pears, a couple of arthropod pests specific to pears. The first is the pear leaf blister mite. This is an Ariyah mite. These are very worm-like mites, long, pale worm-like mites with only 4 legs in the front. They're missing their hind and mid legs. Very minute. So these mites are less than about 1/4 of a millimeter long, so you can't see them with the naked eye, but the damage is readily visible. So the mites they feed on the leaves. They cause these little, often they're green or pink or red blisters on the leaves, and then later on they become darker and necrotic, and this is often when people notice them. They may also cause bud drop in the spring, and they can cause flower and fruit damage in high populations. They will crawl onto the flowers and the fruit and feed. They can cause rusting of the fruit, which means it gets this kind of cracked, almost skin-like texture, like rough skin-like texture on it. And so this is a mite to be on lookout for. Of course, you're not going to see the mites necessarily, but the symptoms can be very drastic. Another one that I've never had experience with, I've never seen, but is in the literature and is around, but not common, it seems like here, is the pear scilla. This is a jumping plant louse, a psyllid. There are many species of psyllids out there that feed on different plants. They're typically host specific. And this one, Pyricola, you can tell it is specific to pears. These are small sap-sucking insects, about 2 to 3 millimeters long. They resemble little tiny cicadas, and the nymphs are kind of flattened. They can produce honeydew that promotes sooty mold growth. As Mike mentioned, if you get a kind of a dusting of like a dark kind of sootiness on plants, sometimes that's from honeydew excreted by insects like aphids, but also psyllids like this. Large infestations can cause psylla shock due to toxin in the saliva, and this can cause fruit and leaf drop. They can also transmit a pear decline phytoplasma. But again, I have not experienced these here in North Carolina. They exist here, but they don't seem to be a huge problem. But if anybody sees them, let us know. I'd be curious to see. Okay, so those are the 2 main pear pests out there. Then we move on to apples. So apples have numerous pests that are fairly specific to this host, and I'm not going to mention every single one out there because we don't have a lot of time to do so, but I will mention some of the major ones. So the first is the codling moth, another tortricid moth, Cydia palmonella. This is tortricids are called leaf-rolling moths or other moths, but they're a super diverse family of small moths. But as you can see, many of these are going to be pests here. So small gray bronze moth here, fairly attractive moth, but the caterpillars are pink and they lack that anal comb that I mentioned in the oriental fruit moth. So if you bust open an apple, you find a caterpillar inside, look for that anal comb, and you can just determine which one it is, maybe, or maybe something else. Larvae overwinter in bark, leaf litter, and pupate in the spring, and they're about 2 generations a year. And the larvae bore straight into the fruit toward the center, sometimes eating the seeds, and they leave the fruit to pupate nearby afterward. You can sometimes see the holes in the fruit with the frass coming out, and I'll show you that in a second. And as well as other moths, many moth species have pheromone traps available to monitor for them. Sometimes there are disruption traps too to disrupt the mating, so you confuse one of the sexes. And this, although it's most commonly affecting apples, it will also feed on pear, but it's not. It's more commonly destructive toward apples. And so here you can see this beautiful little burrow all the way to the pith, the center of the apple, with all these little pellets everywhere, this and silk and whatnot. Those are silk and pellets coming out of a plant or plant part are very typical of caterpillars. They eat a lot of plant material, they defecate a lot, and you can see here where they're connected, you'll have sometimes boring, they'll go into the calyx or the tip of the apple or the sides and just bore right in and leave all that frass-like pellets coming out. So an important pest of apples. Now, I'm not going to talk in detail about these, but there are other torch-twisted moths that are associated with apples and these plants. The larvae of these include the tufted apple bud moth, the red-banded leaf roller, and oblique-banded leaf roller moth. These moths, their caterpillars will often feed skeletonized leaves, feed on leaves. They can cause some damage that way, but often when the leaves are close to the fruits, they will tie the leaves to the fruit and eat the leaf and the fruit surface. And so they can sometimes superficially feed on the fruits, although they won't typically bore into the fruit. And so these can cause damage, surface damage, and can also then allow bacteria and other microorganisms to infest those wounds and cause rot in the fruit. Now, Mike mentioned burr knot, and so our first clearwing moth borer, the dogwood borer, despite its name, it actually has a very wide host range, the widest host range of any of our clearwing moths. And this is Cynanthedon scitula, in the family Cecidae, the clearwing moths. It's got about an inch-long wingspan or inch-wide wingspan, so it's a kind of smaller one, but they are very yellow jacket-like. And these are day-flying moths. They mimic wasps so that they get protection. They do have a broad host range, this species, the dogwood borer, but in apples, it actually will sometimes infest the graft union or the burr knots that grow from the twigs. And these are areas of entry for the caterpillars. And so they prefer infested trees. They may take many years to infest and harm the tree, but they can girdle branches or stems of younger trees or smaller trees as well and can cause damage to them. And these will then, once they're done and ready to pupate, they'll actually kind of poke out the pupa, will wiggle out a bit, and then the moth emerges, and it often leaves little kind of golden skins sticking out of the plants. And this is common for several types of clearwing moth borers. Now, another one that affects apples is the apple maggot. As the name implies, this is a fly. This is in the family Tephrididae, or the fruit flies, Rhagoletis palmonella. These are small flies as adults, about a little bit smaller than a house fly, with bold markings, very bold black and white markings, and the wing patterns are very bold as well. In fact, it's shown that these mimic the legs of spiders, and when viewed from behind, it may mimic a jumping spider to gain protection. Larvae are maggots, so they're legless and headless. They basically just have some mouth hooks at the front. They've got a blunt tip of the abdomen, but otherwise they're a typical maggot. So they overwinter as pupae in the soil. When they emerge in the spring, the adults mate and the females pierce the apple skin to lay eggs underneath. Then the maggot hatches and it bores into the fruit, often causing rot. There's some bacteria and microorganisms associated. This may actually help the maggots feed, but also obviously is not something you want in an apple. And then afterward, they will bore out, drop to the ground, and pupate again. They may have 1 to 2 generations, but sometimes it can take even longer, a couple years, for them to develop fully. And they're actually monitored with a red sticky sphere baited with fruit essence lure. So they're visual. So they look for these red spheres like apples to mate on and to lay eggs. And so that combination of the red sphere and the smell attracts the flies. And so this is how they can be monitored. And when you see apples that are affected by apple maggot, they often have these little puckers or little depressions in flesh in the surface, but you don't see much of a surface damage. That's because the fly has a very tiny needle-like ovipositor that lays the eggs under the skin with very minute holes. But then the maggot will then bore in to the flesh of the fruit. All right, finally, I think this is finally for the apples. So the woolly apple aphid. So woolly apple aphid is a true aphid in the aphididae, Ariosoma linigerum. These are reddish aphids with very short cornicles. So unlike many of the things you learned before about them having the long tailpipes, these you can actually see right here in this one. This little tiny pore right here is the cornicle or the siphunculus. So they're unlike other aphids and they don't have a very long tailpipe, but they typically look like an aphid otherwise. They're reddish with and often covered in this either mealy wax or very long tendrils of wax, thus the name woolly. And there are many aphids that have woolly in the name. They will overwinter as eggs or nymphs on elms if they're present in the area and then feed on the leaves in the spring. Then they travel to apples afterward or remain on the apple when elms aren't present. This is an interesting species in that it has both aerial colonies, which often infest the twigs and stems where there's pruning sites or wounds, and sometimes they will create this rough gall underneath, which is sometimes confused for burr knot. But they will, and I'll show you that in a second what that looks like. But they can also infest the roots with continuous generations underground, and this is actually the most damaging part to plants because it's galling on the roots and it creates a lot of stress and destruction to the root system. And so you can see here's the knobby roots and the reduced roots of a plant that was infested with the subterranean, the root form of the woolly apple aphid. And here is a picture of woolly apple aphid infestation on the twig of a pyracantha relative of an apple, where you have this knobbiness and you have the aphids feeding externally, but the feeding causes knobbiness, especially where they land and colonize, typically where branches meet or during pruning sites or damaged areas of the twigs. And so that is a woolly apple aphid. All right, so there are a few species other than the ones that are general on these types of plants that are affecting peaches, and that really includes two clearwing borer moths. And the first is the peach tree borer. This is the most destructive pest of peach. Again, the family Cicciidae, the clearwing borers, and the same genus as dogwood borer, Cyananthodon, but the species Exidiosa. These are medium-sized moths and caterpillars. They're over an inch long or over an inch wingspan. They're one of the larger of our clearwing borer moths. And the adults are wasp-like and day-active, as are other clearwing borers. Larvae are pale and worm-like, so they're kind of grub-like. They don't look like a typical caterpillar, but that's because they're inside the plant, boring inside. These have one generation per year. The adults are active in late summer and early fall and lay eggs near the base of the host. The caterpillars then hatch and bore into the plant, into the roots and the base, and often through wounds, but can feed on it, can bore in themselves. And this can seriously harm the plants, of course. If you're boring into the roots and the base of the tree, it's going to cut off the lifeline. It's going to cause a lot of damage in the most essential parts of the plant. The signs, as in other borers, is you see gummosis because they're in the peaches and the prunus that produce a lot of that gummosis. But also among the gummosis is frass, sawdust like frass. And if you peel away the bark or do some destructive sampling, you may find the larvae or silk or the frass in the tunnels. And this can be a sign that you have a peach tree borer. Now, pheromone traps are available for this pest as well. And to see this is what the adults look like. So this is an adult male on the left and an adult female. They are very wasp-like, of course, fairly beautiful moths, and again, day flying with these clear wings, probably to mimic wasps because of their day flying activity. So if you see these flying around the bases of your plants, that's a good sign that there's activity. You might want to kind of intervene at that point. And then we've got the peach tree borer, but also there's the lesser peach tree borer. Not that it's any less important or whatnot, but it's just smaller. So it's a bit smaller than the peach tree borer. Again, very similar looking. This is again in the genus Cyananthodon, but this is Pictopes is the species. This has two generations per year. Similar biology to the peach tree borer, but it infests the parts of the tree higher up and in smaller branches. So you can see the trunk above the base, and then these small twigs and branches will also get infested by these little caterpillars, and you'll see that gummosis and frass and whatnot. They're more often abundant in older and wounded trees, and they may cause the bark to peel off and can cause girdling damage in some cases. Now, as with the other moth species, there are pheromone traps available for this pest as well. And I rarely have seen this. I've not gotten samples of this in, but it is out there. And so if you see this weeping, this gummosis, again, like Mike said, gummosis doesn't necessarily mean it's something boring in or whatnot. We've seen gummosis come out of cracks or stressed plants. So, but it's worth investigating if you're finding a lot of it and you're able to wipe it away and see some frass or whatnot. All right, and finally, some arthropod pests of figs. And there's a few pests, but not really many. And really with figs, we're talking about the edible figs, as Mike mentioned. Really, in figs, the general pests mentioned are the most important. These infest the stems, branches, and leaves, and these are spider mites, scale insects, especially, like I said, Japanese maple scale often gets on figs. And so they're the most important pests, but the very common ones, but I would say the most important pests are those that attack the ripe figs. And so people get really frustrated. They're waiting for these figs to ripen. They're about to get them. And then, oh no, they've got insect pests attacking them. Then the damaged fruit attracts many secondary insects and secondary infections and causes the fruit to be unusable or inedible. One thing to note, of course, is that birds and other vertebrates enjoy ripe figs as well. So picking them quickly or using netting can really help. But it's a very difficult time because lots of things are attracted to these ripe fruits. But the two I want to highlight the most are going to be green June beetles. So green June beetles are also called fig eater beetles because they will mob ripened or over-ripened fruit, and they have a very strong nose and very strong body. They can bore right in, just destroy it. They're looking for that sugary, nutritious meat inside the fig. And so if you don't get them to them quick enough, they can start to damage it. And if it's damaged even a little bit, it can introduce rots and whatnot. It can make the fruit unusable and inedible. And so it's really important to monitor them. I should also say that these beetles will feed on lots of different ripe fruits. And so it's not just figs. These are feeding on pear, these are feeding on blackberries. So any overripe fruit can be attacked by these insects as well. So you want to make sure that your timing of picking the fruit is good enough to avoid getting the damage from these beetles. And furthermore, lots of other large insects like the soft flesh and the sugary, nutritious meat of these figs. And so wasps will also often break into figs and feed on them. Of course, you probably shouldn't leave them this long or let them get this ripe, but large hornets, large wasps, and things like that will readily go and break into them. Flies and other insects that can suck or only kind of lap up things, they don't have hard mouth parts, they're typically going to come in secondarily and feed on the kind of juices and whatnot on there. But these insects like the beetles and the hornets that have mandibles or have very hard bodies and heads that can get into them will then invade those fruits.
Yeah, I was just checking the chat here to see if there was anything that we need to talk about before we move to BOLOs. Charlotte's handling the brown marmorated stink bugs.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, and yes, thank you, Charlotte, for posting those links. If you didn't see them, be sure and check out the links there to things like the disease and insect management and home orchard.
Yep. That should help answer Dan Dalton's question about how often you should spray. There's some good descriptions on those pages of the timing. And oftentimes it's based on the growth of the plant is when you time the pest sprays and everything. So yeah, those are going to be very helpful. All right,
Bolo
so
away.
let's talk about some arthropod bolos for April and May. So late April, early May. So May beetles, as the name suggests, although some people call these June bugs, but common names we know are whatever. They're not as accurate. But these members of the genus Phylophaga are these kind of chestnut-like or these nut-like beetles that kind of often fly around lights. In fact, I saw a spider catch one at my porch light the other day. And so these are very common. They don't typically cause much damage to plants, although some can feed on foliage. But it's just to be aware that they're around. They may be a nuisance. Reducing porch lights and light usage outside will keep them from being attracted to the home and kind of knocking into windows and whatnot. You may be starting to see young bagworms. I mean, you may not see them because they're so tiny, but this is the time when you might want to scout for them on plants that have been infested in previous years. This is when they're most susceptible, and you can see they have a little tiny bag of their own, but they're very tiny. These are the needles of an arborvitae, and this is how tiny these larvae are. So once they get really big, they're much more difficult to control, and so this might be a time to go scout for young bagworms. There's going to be a lot of garden bugs and caterpillars starting to be out there. And so you guys start to see a lot of leafhopper damage on your mints and herbs and stuff like that. You guys see caterpillars in the garden. So too many to cover now, but we're starting to get in the very active time of year for insects and other arthropods. Check your roses for sawflies. These are not caterpillars, so BT and a few other things won't work on them. They are technically a little type of wasp, but a plant feeding wasp. And so check for little windows in your roses or little holes in the roses. Flip them over the leaves, inspect for these. And there are a few species of sawflies associated with roses out there. We did get a picture from a master gardener the other day in email. I didn't get to use it because I already had this one in there, but galls are starting to form and expand on plants. So these are witch hazel cone gall aphid galls, as well as these are young wool sower galls on white oak. And these pom-poms are multiple little wasps are developing in them. So be on the lookout for them. They typically don't cause serious damage. We did just get in some blackberries into the clinic with some gall wasps in the base of the plants, which can actually cause weakness and damage to those plants. But they're fairly sporadic pests. But those on oaks and those on witch hazels, a few other hosts where we know about them and they're not going to cause a lot of damage. Just read up about them, but just kind of take a look at them. Don't worry too much about them causing harm. And these insects have evolved with these plants for millions of years. Of course, we've got getting rain, which is great for plants, but also that means there's more habitat for mosquitoes. Also check for ticks. This is when we're going to see a lot more activity starting up. In fact, I was out grilling last night and the mosquito was flying around already. So they are active and biting and sucking blood and whatnot. So take care of yourselves out there. Wear repellents and check for ticks and whatnot if you're working outdoors, and just be careful. And finally, of course, lots of other critters. So just about everything is waking up and getting active. You may see really beautiful things like rosy maple moths or stilt-legged flies or whatnot, but go out in your gardens, take a look, and remember, not most critters are not harmful. Be sure to be aware, observe them, and also identify them just to make sure. And if you ever have any questions, we're here at the clinic to help. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mike.
All right. Thanks, Matt. And of course, I will not pass up the opportunity to remind folks of the old joke. I thought of it, Matt, as you were talking.
I could guess what it is now, but
Yes.
yes. What is it?
It's what's worse than finding a worm in an apple?
Yeah. Finding half a worm.
Finding half a worm in an apple. Exactly.
And of course, now we know that worm could be an apple maggot. It could be a codling moth. It could be an oriental fruit moth. It could be plum cuculio. So yeah, you could have a lot of worm-like critters in your apples. So hopefully you don't find 3 different types of worms, or at least 3 halves of worms in your apples or anything like that.
Yeah, that would be
so yeah, a very unlucky one.
Fortuitous bite. Yeah. All right, let's do a few be on the lookouts from this now season, as really we kind of felt like we had summer already, but thankfully the rains have come as well. So the timing may be a little bit different this year from what we've seen typically, but let me just give you a few things to be on the lookout for in the disease world in the coming months. Of course, powdery mildews will be building up their populations. You see it especially on certain hosts like euonymus, crepe myrtle, and susceptible varieties of crepe myrtle. You may see it on very small dogwood seedlings, a number of other plants. So that's always one to be on the lookout for. We've talked in earlier months about the exobicidium leaf gall on camellias, and I had fewer of those this year, but we did pick some off of our sasanquas this year. But now we're going to be on the lookout for the other one that gets on azaleas. And so it has a less dense sort of gall, and it'll just form these kind of puckered. I've seen them actually as kind of concave, almost hollow in growths on the leaves of the azaleas. In our roses, the 2 leaf spot diseases that we most see, of course, are black spot and cercospora leaf spot. Here's a picture of a rose in April of, let's see, 5 years ago now, and you see the spots there. We get a little bit of a closer look here and here, and notice how these spots, they are necrotic, they are associated with some chlorosis there, some yellowing of the leaves, but notice that the spots have very defined, well-defined circular margins. And this is, well, Cercospora leaf spot would be the old common name, and the fungus name has been changed a couple of times now. For a while it was Passiflora rosicola, but now it's Rosaspherella rosicola. And that can be differentiated from black spot with the more, well, the consistently dark spot in black spot, but also that kind of feathered edge to the blotch itself. And you can see in both of these cases very faintly the sporulation of the fungi involved. Be aware that just because a rose is resistant to one doesn't mean it's resistant to the other. All right, we are seeing our cane and leaf rust of blackberry. The picture on the left is an archived one, but the picture on the right there was a sample that just came in last week, I think. And you can see this is the cane and leaf rust. It's not the systemic one, not the orange rust. So this one is less serious. Iris, you want to be on the lookout for this disease here, very unsightly leaf spotting caused by a heterosporium, is be a name you may know it by, but I believe it's now classified as a calatosporium, that leaf spot of iris. And we've already actually, I think, had a sample or two, image sample or two come into the clinic of rose rosette, that first symptom being the elongation of the new shoots, the retention of the juvenile red color, rose rosette disease. And just to kind of, we won't put this out as a poll or anything, but these are some of the symptoms that you may see. The early indications of trouble, as I say, that red coloration that doesn't go away. Oftentimes there'll be some red in the new foliage, but if it's retained, it doesn't go to green, then you've got a symptom of rose rosette, the excess elongation of the new shoots. You may get the witch's brooms, that shoot proliferation, and then two that are only caused by rose rosette. One is where you get the young stems that are wider than the cane that is producing them, and the hyperthorniness. Now, that's not always going to be there, but if you see that hyperthorniness, then there's nothing else that does that. All right, witch's brooms can be caused by herbicides as well, so do be a little bit cautious there. In the vegetable garden, herbicide injury. So we're out there applying our herbicides this time of year, and sometimes we get a little drift, or we may have gotten in a load of compost that has some herbicide contamination. So be aware of those possibilities. Under and over fertilization. Watch out for bacterial leaf spot on your pepper and tomato transplants. Make sure that you got healthy transplants going into the garden. Early blight on tomato, and tomato spotted wilt virus on tomato. You see that in the photograph in the lower left there is one of the things that we may see early in the season. As always, if you haven't gotten enough BOLOs here on PP&P, you can go to our website and click on the BOLO icon or scan this QR code. All right, how'd we do?
We made it. I could have included 10 other things now, Florian.
Yeah, how do people feel?
I will say we do get a lot of home orchards that are seriously infested by a lot of things. So they are, let's just say if you plan on growing these types of plants, it's going to be very intensive to make sure you get the grocery store quality produce. They have huge spray programs in these commercial orchards and whatnot. So just beware. It's not a set it and forget it type of crop.
Yes, thank you, Matt and Mike. I think in Extension, if we can convince at least half the people who wanted to grow fruit trees that really they shouldn't, and there's other options, maybe some of the small fruits or vegetables, I think we've been successful there because they are a lot of work in our climate. All right, but one thing that's really important for fruit trees are pollinators. So we are going to finish today up with talking about a great plant for pollinator habitat as part of our Plant These for Pollinator feature, which we have in each of our Plants, Pests and Pathogen webinars. And just a reminder, if you are maximizing pollinator habitat, you want to have multiple different types of plants in bloom each month throughout the growing season, which for us can start February, March, and run through November and down at the coast even December. So you want to have multiple things blooming throughout the season to support a wide range of pollinators. So we've been featuring one plant a month that you can add to your landscape. That's a great plant for landscapes throughout North Carolina and is commercially available. And this month I'm going to talk about Blue Star, which is a perennial that is in the genus Amsonia. There are multiple species. We're going to focus on a few that are the most commercially available, and then I'm going to mention one more that is also native to North Carolina. So Blue Star or the Amsonia species all tend to be very long-lived, spring-blooming perennials. There are 16 species in the southeastern United States, but there's really only 2 that you run into pretty frequently at garden centers or nurseries that carry a range of perennials. One of them being the Blue Star pictured here, which is Amsonia tabernae montana. But all of the species will have the same type of flower structure where they have these clusters of star-shaped flowers, which are typically blue or pale blue. There's one species native in more of the Southwest that has white flowers. All the species I've ever grown have been very deer and rabbit resistant. Now, I can't speak to every species, like some of those more Western species, but all the ones, again, that I've ever grown have produced a milky latex, so a white sap, when you cut the stems or break the leaves, and that helps deter the deer and rabbits. It can also be a little bit annoying when you're pruning them because it can get all over your pruners. Just be aware of that and clean off your pruners afterwards. And I do recommend, and I like to in my garden, to cut back my Amsonias after they bloom. I cut them back to remove the old flower head and cut off maybe about 6 inches of growth. This helps keep them a little bit tidier or a little bit tighter or a little bit shorter, and it limits self-seeding. So if you do leave the old flower heads to develop, they will produce seeds, and it will self-seed in the garden, especially in places where the mulch is a little thin. So that might be something you really want. So in that case, leave them. Or maybe you want to collect the seed to propagate them. They're fairly easy to grow from seed. But if you've got all you want, I would recommend cutting them back. And they are all pollinator favorites, as you can see here, this one being visited by one of our native bees. So the first species I want to talk about is often just referred to as Blue Star. And again, it is Amsonia tabernae montana. It is the most widespread as far as its native range, and it does occur through much of the southeastern United States up into the mid-Atlantic. It can be found all across North Carolina, especially in wetter areas. In the garden, it's perfectly happy in wetter soils and tolerates flooding. One of the first places I found it in the wild was kind of just under a bridge. And I used to make the joke, it was growing under a bridge, but it's no troll. So it's an excellent plant, a beautiful plant. It's quite happy in heavy clay. So it's just pretty tough. And the only thing that would really challenge it would be very sandy soil. So you want to keep it somewhere on the moister side. It will grow and bloom quite prolifically in full sun to part shade. In drier soils, it will probably be happier in a little bit of shade, especially afternoon shade. And it will grow 2 to 3 feet tall, or maybe a little more. It is quite variable, and traditionally, it had been divided out into 2 or 3 subspecies. Now some of those have been made their own species. So there is some variability over what's out there as Amsonia tabernae montana. Some of it may have a wider leaf or a slightly narrower leaf. Some of them may be a little taller, a little paler, a little darker blue. So ideally, if you are going for a really specific look, you might want to buy it when it's in bloom, which is typically this time of year, April and May. And depending on where you are in North Carolina, I've found that a lot of my perennials and shrubs, spring blooming, are blooming 2 to 3 weeks early this year. We had so much warm weather early. Now it looks like everything's going to slow down. It's going to be cooler for a little while. Maybe that'll put the brakes on and hold the blooms for a little while. But the Amsonias have just kind of passed peak bloom in my landscape here in the central part of North Carolina. So as I mentioned, there are some subspecies. One of them, called variety salicifolia, has narrow leaves, and in fact that name salicifolia means willow-like. Willows are in the genus Salix, so salicifolia for Salix. So this is one you should be able to find at garden centers that carry a range of perennials. And it is just a great plant for everywhere, but very, very dry places. And it'd be an excellent candidate for rain gardens as well. Now, if you do have drier sites, you're in luck. There's a couple of Amsonias for you. Probably the one that you're going to have the most, it's going to be easiest to find at garden centers is the Arkansas Blue Star, Amsonia hubrichtii. It has actually a very narrow or small native range in the Ouachita Mountains, which are in central Arkansas and a little bit into Oklahoma. But it is one of the most adaptable species. So a lot of times when we see something with a pretty narrow range, we wouldn't expect it to be very adaptable, but this one certainly is. And it's very drought tolerant. It has these really fine thread-like leaves, which often in plants is an adaptation for drought because they have less leaf surface to lose moisture from. It does grow best in well-drained soil and sun. It does well in clay as long as it's not a heavy, wet clay, more of an orange, red clay that has good internal drainage. Also blooms in April and May. The flowers tend to be, of all the ones I've seen, a little paler than the Amsonia tabernae montana we were just looking at before. And it grows a little taller. It will definitely exceed 3 feet once it's established and a few years old in the garden, both in height and width. So much so it almost looks like a small shrub in summer. And the foliage tends to be just really resilient and green after the blooms pass. It's kind of a nice, just a foliage feature with that fine texture and the fullness of it. And it is often described as the leaves being needle-like, just in that they're very narrow, not that they are sharp at all. They're very soft. I also mentioned if you do have more than one species of Amsonia in your garden, because the bees love them so much, they will move between them while they're blooming because they all tend to have overlapping bloom periods. And you will likely, if you collect seed or let some of the seeds mature and self-seed, get some hybrids between them. So they regularly hybridize between the different species. And Amsonia is one of the few perennials that has really nice fall color and is actually known and sometimes grown for its fall color as much as for its flowers. This is a mass planting of Amsonia hubrichtii at the National Arboretum, which is up in Washington, D.C. There's a little bit of aster poking through as well. Those are the purple flowers. But it very reliably turns these golden yellow colors that sometimes have some of these rusty highlights. And that's true for both the Amsonia tabernae montana and this Amsonia hubrichtii. So that's another time of the year where it really looks spectacular. And the last species I want to mention is the Sandhills Blue Star. And this one's a little harder to find. You'd probably have to seek it out at nurseries that really specialize in native plants. It's actually my favorite one, probably just because it's rare, but it is Amsonia ciliata. And it does occur in North Carolina in the sandhills, and it can also be found in dry woodland and sandhill areas in some of our other southeastern states, including South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, over through to Texas. It is definitely drought tolerant. It grows in very sandy soil, so it's going to be best in well-drained sites in sun to light or part shade. Same kind of bloom time, usually these kind of pale blue flowers. It is a little shorter. That's one thing that's different about it compared to the other two species. And the foliage looks much like the Amsonia hubrichtii we just looked at, but it's got little tiny fine hairs all around the edges of the leaves, and that's actually just what ciliate means from the species name. Ciliata is covered in fine hairs. And you can see the blooms here. And here is the plant in bloom, which when they bloom, they really are not even a foot tall when they bloom out. Then after they bloom, like the other Amsonias, they will put on a lot of growth in the summer. So it'll get to be a larger plant after flowering, which again can be helpful just to deadhead and trim them back a little bit after blooming. So you can explore these Amsonias on the Plant Toolbox, learn all about them, see lots more pictures. And if you really want to dig deep and learn almost all there is to know about Amsonia, there is an excellent report from the Mount Cuba Center, which is up in Delaware, and they do trials of various native plants from the Mid-Atlantic, excuse me, many of which, of course, this is very applicable to us here in North Carolina. And they did a 10-year trial of 20 different Amsonias. That included species and some cultivars. And there's lots of great information in there, but a spoiler, they all did really well. So Ipsodia in general, whereas a lot of times in their trial reports, some cultivars are much, much lower, or some species rate much lower than others. The Ipsonias are just a great group of plants, so they all came out fairly similarly and highly rated for landscape use. Okay, we'll wrap up with just some announcements. First, if you missed our webinar, if you want to learn more about more plants for pollinators, and you missed our Day of Giving webinar with Dr. Dan Potter from the University of Kentucky, he spoke about trees for bees, and not just trees, but also shrubs, so woody plants. The recording is posted on the NCEMG intranet, and the resources he mentioned are there as well in the resource doc. So really encourage you to explore that and learn about woody plants that are great for supporting pollinators. We also had quite a few continuing education events since our last Plants, Pests, and Pathogens webinar. Those recordings are available on our NCEMG intranet, and they include the Engaging Young Children in Hands-on Learning with Kyle Hood, who is at NC State, and Digital Accessibility Essentials with Bethany Greger, also here at NC State with Extension IT. So great opportunities to learn. We hope everybody has their calendar marked for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, which will be August 21st and 22nd this year. And there are lots of great resources that Amanda Bratcher, who is the state coordinator for the Great Southeast Pollinator Census in North Carolina, she has developed and has available on the website, the Great Southeast Pollinator Census in NC website. So that link is one of the links that'll be in our resource doc. And if you want to really dig in and learn a lot about the pollinators that we have in our landscapes and in our natural areas here in North Carolina and throughout the Southeast, and that are what we will be looking for during the Great Southeast Pollinator Census, I really encourage you to check out the Great Southeast Pollinator Course, which is a webinar series from June 16th to July 28th, coordinated by the University of Georgia Extension. And of course, join us at EMG College this fall. Let me just make sure I've got that slide in there. Yep. We hope you will, not this fall, we hope you will join us at EMG College this summer to learn more about pollinators and how you can encourage people to protect pollinators in their landscapes. So this will have a webinar series as well as an in-person workshop. You will get to choose which workshop you attend, and one will be held in Greenville, more in the eastern part of the state, the other in Statesville, kind of in the western Piedmont area. So we hope that makes it more convenient for folks to attend. So registration is now open, and it'll remain open through May 15th or until it fills up. So there has been a lot of registration. We do have 75 seats open for each of the workshop. So if you want to attend, I really encourage you to register soon to make sure you get a spot. And with that, we'll wrap things up. Actually, a few minutes ahead of schedule. Just letting everybody know we look forward to seeing you next month when Barb Fair will be our guest speaker. Many of Barb, she is our extension specialist for landscape, arboriculture, and urban greening. She's also an associate professor in the Department of Horticultural Science at NC State. She will be talking about what you need to know about trees and taking care of trees, and this will be more like landscape trees. So we had fruit trees today. Next month, we will be looking at landscape trees, shade trees, which bring many benefits to our landscapes. So we look forward to seeing you then, and that will be May 26th, back at 10 a.m. And that wraps us up. Let me open the chat just to see if there are any additional questions, or Matt and Mike, if you saw any additional questions you'd like to jump in and address.
I didn't see anything specifically, although there was somebody who asked about eating damaged fruits. And unfortunately, I'm not a nutritionist or health expert. I would say if they're just deformed and they're no rot and whatever, then obviously it's probably fine. It may not taste great, but I don't know that there's anything
Yeah, and I
you
don't
know.
have good information on that too, because one of the things yeah, I don't have good information. But if it's something just superficial, like your city blotch, your fly speck, you can just peel the apple and then you're good. But I assume that the questioner was asking about more extensive damage.
Yeah, I have noticed especially in apples, like you buy a bag and one will be partially rotted, you try to cut that out, it's kind of a soft rot. Those apples do not taste good.
Mm.
So,
Yeah, if I can cut out a little bit of it and have a lot of the fruit left, it seems to be fine. But I
yeah,
cut pretty far into it just to make sure I get it all fresh and everything. I don't think it's necessarily dangerous to eat. It's just probably not nice and may make you sick or something, like, as it doesn't taste good or feel good. But I don't think it's gonna harm people necessarily. But yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and I will also mention I have a huge fig tree. It's a Celeste fig, over 10 years old. It was like 15 feet tall and 20 feet wide. It really got hammered this winter. It's mostly dead. It's coming
Mm.
back from the base, and now actually I've seen some ambrosia beetle. So that may have been
Uh,
what killed it more, or are they secondary? Do you think they're secondary, or do you
Oh, I'm
think?
sure. Yeah, so it's the ambrosia beetles are coming in on that. We one of my favorite examples for the fact that ambrosia beetles are secondary is that we have a bunch of figs on campus, of course, behind Kilgore. You all know everything. And one year I went out there just to take some photos, and I saw a multi-stem plant where one of the stems was cracked and all that stuff. It had ambrosia beetles, fresh toothpicks coming out of it. All the other stems of the plant were completely fine because they weren't
Mm,
affected. And so they will even target, I've even seen them target like cankers or areas just in the
mm,
middle of one branch that are dying. And the next branch over the trunk will be completely pristine. And again, that just is evidence that they're really homing in. They can't grow the fungus in healthy plant tissue. And so they
mhm.
really need
Yeah.
the tissue that's dead. So really, it's probably, we see a lot of, like Mike mentioned, a lot of freeze and cold damage. And so could have been that.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, the ambrosia beetles are secondary in that case then. So,
Okay.
but they'll
So
tell you
maybe
which
there's,
ones are bad. Well, they'll tell you which stems are bad, I guess, and which branches
yeah.
are bad.
So maybe there's a little bit of hope if I cut it back and let those shoots that are coming out from the bottom grow, that they could be healthy.
Possibly, yeah. And
Maybe.
if it was just the winter damage and can grow structurally, it can grow right. Of course, I'm not a horticulturalist, so don't quote me on any of that. So,
All right. I'll report back on in
yeah,
future how it does.
yes, we want pictures, Charlotte.
yeah. Thanks everyone
Okay.
for attending. Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely.
I know.
Yes.
Sorry if you're thinking about worms in your apples now. I know. I'm sorry, or maggots or whatnot. So just remember, everything that tastes good to you probably tastes good to some kind of critter or disease. And so there, and we were just commenting. I was asking Mike, I was like, it's really funny with rosaceous hosts, peaches, plums, apples, pears, strawberries. They seem to be not very chemically defended. They seem to be very nice tasting. So a lot of organisms really like them. They're very physically defended with like thorns and whatnot, but they don't seem to be like the broccolis and the cucurbits and all these other ones that produce a lot of solanaceous crops that produce all these crazy chemicals and are toxic. Rosaceous crops just seem to be like, well, we'll just grow out of it or we'll do whatever. How they're really defending themselves, and they just seem like the tastiest, most naive kind of plants out there. That's just my opinion, I guess, which is good because I love them. They're great plants, but yeah. So
That's great. I love that. They're naive. That's a great description.
now they do poke us a lot. I did push out
They,
a thorn the other day from the blackberry. I got one on my fingers, so they are very good at keeping things off physically. So yeah. All
all
right.
right.
Well, thanks a
Well,
lot for your
thank
help,
you.
of course, and thanks everyone for attending. And good luck out there and enjoy the weather.
Yep. Thanks, Charlotte.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Ariyah. Yep. Everybody have a good month.
Absolutely. See y'all in May.